Okay, let's unpack this incredible compressed story of leadership, strategy, and restoration.
Absolutely.
We are diving deep into what is really one of the most remarkable administrative feats in ancient history.
It really is. And it's set during this post-exilic period.
A time defined by just massive challenges, right?
Yeah.
Both physical, a completely ruined capital city.
And spiritual, a community that was, just broken.
And it's all encapsulated perfectly by the journey of one man, Nehemiah.
It truly is a study in focused, relentless, and just incredibly rapid leadership. You have to understand the core problem he was
Lay
facing.
that the scene for us.
The walls of Jerusalem, which are the symbolic and literal defense of God's people, had been in ruins for over 140 years.
Wow, 140 years.
Ever since Nebuchadnezzar came in and just completely destroyed the city and the temple back in 586 BC.
That's a staggering amount of time. Generations had passed since the original destruction.
Exactly. So when the exiles started trickling back home, this returned remnant.
The ones who had survived the trauma of exile.
Yes. They were living in a highly vulnerable condition. They faced continuous opposition, mockery, and what the source material calls considerable adversity and reproach.
So they had a rebuilt temple, thanks to Zerubbabel, but they had zero defense.
None. They were a sitting target.
And this is where Nehemiah enters the scene.
And his personal background is just as interesting as his mission. He was a high-ranking Jewish official serving in the heart of the great Persian Empire.
Right in the center of power.
Specifically, as the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes.
And we should probably clarify what that means. This wasn't a low-level service position.
Oh, not at all. In the ancient Near East, the cupbearer was essentially a food taster, yes, but also a personal assistant, an intelligence officer.
Trusted confidant.
A role second only to the king himself. He had unprecedented access and influence.
And his name itself, Nehemiah, which means Yahweh has comforted, it almost feels like a foreshadowing, doesn't it?
It really does.
The mission we are tracing today is just so rapid, so intense, and it's kind of dual in nature. First, you have the unbelievably swift physical rebuilding of the walls, the critical protective foundation.
And second, and arguably much harder, is the restoration of the spiritual community under the Mosaic Law.
It's an epic of political savvy, meeting, spiritual zeal, all condensed into just a few crucial years.
And to appreciate the weight and the timing of this mission, we absolutely need to start with the historical and prophetic context.
Right.
The Jews had been restored to the land, but the whole thing was happening under this huge shadow of the prophecy of the 70 years of captivity, which was first declared by Jeremiah.
And what's fascinating, according to our sources, is that this prophecy acts as two witnesses to God's faithfulness.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it provides two distinct, literal ways the 70 years were fulfilled. It sort of removes any doubt about God's adherence to his word.
Okay, so break that down. What's the first fulfillment?
The first one is purely chronological. It starts with the first deportation in 605 BC.
Which is when Daniel was taken captive and the temple vessels were first looted.
Exactly. 70 years later, it concludes precisely with Cyrus's edict in 538 BC, which allowed the Jews under Zerubbabel to return and start the work.
A perfect 70-year span for the captivity itself.
Right. And then you have the second fulfillment.
Okay.
This one focuses on the physical destruction and restoration of the sacred site itself.
So the temple.
Yes. It runs from the definitive destruction of the temple by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC right up to the temple's official completion and dedication in 515 BC.
And that's exactly 70 years.
Exactly 70 years. This provided this foundational narrative of divine promise and faithfulness for Nehemiah's generation when they began their work.
But here's where the timing moves beyond just being historical context and enters the realm of prophetic anchor points.
Okay.
Our sources highlight the calculated significance of Artaxerxes' decree to rebuild Jerusalem, the decree Nehemiah successfully negotiated.
How certain are the sources about that precise date? That level of detail is incredible, but does it stand up to critical analysis, or is it purely a theological interpretation?
Well, it stands up remarkably well within the theological framework that the sources provide. The text points to the decree being issued on March 5, 444 BC.
That's specific.
That's specific. And that date is marked as the precise beginning of Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy from Daniel chapter 9.
So it functions as a chronological anchor for the rest of Israel's timeline leading up to the Messiah.
Exactly.
Wait, I remember that highly specific number in the original sources. This calculation is striking. 69 of those prophetic weeks translate to exactly 173,880 days.
It's an astounding level of chronological precision.
So what does that mean for the person just trying to follow the story?
It's the ultimate confirmation of divine planning. The source material meticulously calculates that those 173,880 days were literally fulfilled when Jesus, as Israel's Messiah, made his famous royal entry into Jerusalem.
Which historical accounts date to March 30, AD 33.
The connection is direct and immediate.
That kind of chronological tightrope walk demonstrates that Nehemiah's political and engineering project rebuilding a wall in 444 BC was not some random historical event.
No, it was a divinely ordained, essential prerequisite for the ultimate unfolding of salvation history, centuries later.
It ties the bricks and mortar directly into the broader cosmic plan.
Exactly. Now, let's look at the immediate catalyst for action. Nehemiah was residing in Susa, the winter capital,
A place of luxury and power.
in the month of Kislev in 445 BC. So he was physically and politically far removed from the distress happening in Jerusalem.
And he received this devastating news from his relative Hanani and some other men who had just traveled from Judah.
And the news was brutal. The walls are breached, the gates are burned, and the Jews back home are facing great trouble and reproach.
That stability he enjoyed in Susa must have felt like a cruel contrast to the suffering of his people.
And his response is so key to his character. It wasn't a knee-jerk political flight to action or an immediate negotiation with the king.
No, it was 4 months of intense internal spiritual preparation.
He said he sat down abruptly, crying and mourning for several days. I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven.
And that period stretched from December 445 BC to March 444 BC, 4 full months.
That 4-month prayer marathon wasn't just begging God for help. It was a deep theological engagement.
Let's really dissect the content of that prayer. He started with total confession, acknowledging Israel's corporate sin.
He says, both I, myself, and my family have sinned.
That immediate inclusion of himself is just powerful leadership.
It is, because he recognized that their suffering wasn't random. It was the consequence of a broken covenant.
But the prayer then pivots to an even bolder argument.
He reminds God of the Mosaic promise laid out in Deuteronomy 30.
Right.
The promise that if the people repent and obey, even if they were scattered to the remotest part of the earth, God promised to gather them and bring them back.
So he was essentially holding God to his own loyal covenantal promise of restoration based on their new repentance.
It's an incredibly bold way to approach the Creator, not begging, but reminding him of his own sworn word.
No, when he finally approached King Artaxerxes, the stakes were just unbelievably high.
They were life and death. Nehemiah's visible sadness, his dejected appearance, was a massive risk.
In that kind of highly ritualized, controlled environment of the Persian court, unhappiness could be seen as dissatisfaction with the ruler.
Which was potentially a treasonous offense, punishable by death. The source notes he was very fearful.
And he had to conceal his pain for 4 months until that moment was right.
And here is the beautiful moment that speaks volumes about the nature of his daily walk with God.
When the king finally notices his sadness and asks, "What is it you are seeking?"
Nehemiah doesn't just launch into his political pitch, he takes a measurable pause.
Yes, that spontaneous prayer.
The source identifies this quick, unscripted moment of prayer as Nehemiah silently reaching out to God while he was conversing with the most powerful man on earth.
It was a recognition that the ultimate decision-maker was not the monarch sitting across from him,
but the God of heaven.
That silent prayer was then immediately followed by a well-prepared strategic request. He didn't just ask to go home.
No, he asked for a specific commission to Judah to rebuild the city where his ancestors were buried. He made it personal and actionable.
And the king's approval. If the king saw value in strengthening Judah against Egypt, why wasn't this done earlier? Did Nehemiah just capitalize on a political window that opened at that exact moment?
That's a great question. The sources suggest Artaxerxes, with his queen sitting beside him, was indeed being politically calculating.
Okay.
Previous attempts to rebuild the walls had been stopped by royal decree, but the geopolitical situation had shifted. A stronger, fortified Judah, populated by loyal Jewish subjects, would stabilize the volatile province of Syria and provide a solid bulwark on the border with their perennial rival, Egypt.
So Nehemiah was perfectly positioned to exploit a temporary political opportunity.
It seemed so. And Artaxerxes granted the requests, letters for safe travel through the often hostile governors of Trans-Euphrates.
A military escort to signal royal authority and deter immediate local opposition.
And perhaps most practically, a letter for Asaph, the keeper of the king's massive nature preserve, ensuring Nehemiah would get all the timber he needed.
Total success. And Nehemiah attributes all of this, the king's favor, the materials, the protection, to the good hand of my God was on me.
Which leads us right into our first big section, leadership by strategy, secrecy, and specificity. This story becomes the definitive masterclass in effective crisis management.
Absolutely. When management analysts look at the Book of Nehemiah, they often focus solely on the rapid construction, but his real genius was in the organization and planning before a single stone was moved.
Yes.
So instead of listing all 21 principles found in the sources, let's focus on a few that really resonate for us today, for you, the learner.
Okay.
First, there's that incredible patience we already discussed, waiting 4 months for God's timing, despite the urgency of the problem.
Modern leadership so often just rushes into action without sufficient prayer or planning.
And critically, the preparation. He didn't just complain about the problem, he presented a detailed, resourced solution.
He knew exactly what he needed. Letters for passage, wood for gates, and he asked for it specifically. He didn't assume. He documented his needs in advance.
And third, the way he related to his team. He demonstrated respect for his superior, King Artaxerxes, but when he finally spoke to the people of Jerusalem, he immediately identified himself with them.
He didn't stand above them as the Persian governor.
No, he said, you see the problem that we have. He united them by sharing the ownership of the failure and the solution.
That identification was absolutely crucial to getting buy-in, which brings us to the moment of arrival and the element of secrecy.
Nehemiah arrived, took 3 days to rest and plan, and then the night inspection began.
This secret assessment is absolutely key to his strategy. It's a brilliant psychological maneuver.
He surveyed the walls and gates, the valley gate, the Well of the Dragons, the Dung Gate at night, with only a few trusted men.
And he deliberately didn't tell any of the officials, the priests, or the nobles what he was doing.
Why? Why the secrecy?
Well, the secrecy had two powerful rationales. Rationale one was purely tactical. He wanted to prevent the powerful external enemies, Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, from observing his plan.
So they couldn't stir up immediate riots or rush back to the king with preemptive counter-appeals.
Exactly. He needed to execute the plan swiftly and definitively.
And what was rationale two?
This one speaks volumes about human nature and internal dynamics. It was about avoiding inertia.
Meaning?
He wanted to prevent the Jews themselves from preemptively offering arguments about why the walls could not be rebuilt.
Ah, I see. He knew if he asked them first, they would list 140 years of failed attempts, a lack of resources, the strength of their enemies.
He wanted to formulate the plan, establish its complete attainability, and then present the vision, bypassing the inertia of doubt and the negativity of old habits. He was preventing the "but we can't" syndrome.
So when he finally did pitch the plan to the people, he didn't start with their duty or the danger.
No, he started by validating the mission. He related how the good hand of my God was on me and what the king had said, effectively wrapping the political approval in divine favor.
And that validation was the spark?
It was. The people's immediate positive reply was instant and unified. Let's begin rebuilding right away.
They were convinced by the tangible evidence of God's favor on their leader and were ready to work.
Which moves us into the organization itself. Chapter 3 can seem, on the surface, like one of the dullest chapters in the Bible.
It's a lot of names and places.
But it's actually the most meticulous record of communal dedication. It reads like an architect's inventory, honoring every single person who participated in reestablishing Israel.
The methodology was pure genius. The reconstruction was organized geographically, described section by section, starting with the sheep gate in the northeast and moving counterclockwise.
Right. And if you look at a map of Nehemiah's Jerusalem, the scale of the task is just immense. It covers the fish gate, the Jeshanah gate, the dung gate, the fountain gate, key fortified structures.
It was a massive undertaking, and the diversity of the collaborative effort is phenomenal. This wasn't just a military or construction crew effort.
Not at all. You had Eliashib the high priest and his colleagues building the sheep gate.
Then you had specialized guilds working right alongside them. Uzziel, identified as a goldsmith, and Hananiah, a perfumer, worked on significant sections.
It was a total mobilization of the entire community.
And it wasn't just professionals and priests either. We see specific mention of families, districts, and even individuals who might surprise you.
Like Shallum, son of Halahash, head of a half-district of Jerusalem.
Right. He worked on his section, assisted specifically by his daughters.
I love that detail.
It paints such a vivid picture of the community's commitment. Everyone, regardless of status or gender, was invested in this holy project.
But the source notes a sharp, immediate contrast.
The men of Tekoa worked on their section diligently.
But their town leaders refused to assist with the work of their master, Nehemiah.
That highlights the presence of immediate internal resistance right alongside this widespread dedication.
For the builders, construction was an act of consecration, a religious duty. But for the internal enemies, often driven by class or pride, they were immediately present.
They were willing to delegate the risk and the labor, but refused to dirty their own hands.
And that failure of the local aristocracy to participate sets the stage perfectly for Section 2, external opposition.
Because as soon as the work started, the enemies came out swinging, realizing that ridicule was the cheapest form of attack.
Exactly. We meet the main antagonists again, Sanballat the Horonite, who was the governor of Samaria.
Tobiah the Ammonite official, whose name ironically means Yahweh is good, despite his wicked intentions.
And later, Geshem the Arab.
Their initial response, as soon as they heard the reconstruction was underway, was pure psychological warfare.
Derision, contempt, and they tried to delegitimize the entire project politically by leveling the charge of rebellion against the king.
They asked Nehemiah, "Are you rebelling against the king?"
And the ridicule was meant to shatter morale. Sanballat mocked the capacity of these feeble Jews and questioned their ability to sacrifice and finish.
But Tobiah's taunt is famous for its venom. If even a fox were to climb up on what they are building, it would break down their wall of stones.
That was designed to make every single stone they laid feel utterly useless.
Nehemiah's response, which is so crucial for anyone facing opposition, was twofold.
First, he offered an imprecatory prayer, asking God to turn the reproach back onto their own heads. He trusted God, not himself, to handle the vengeance.
And second, to the enemies directly, he was completely uncompromising.
He stated that the God of heaven would prosper them and firmly deny the antagonists any just or ancient right in Jerusalem.
That flat denial of their right to the city was essential. Nehemiah knew that by accepting an invitation to debate or compromise their claim, he would be legitimizing their standing. He just shut them down.
But as the wall breaches began to close and the gaps disappeared, the enemies realized that psychological warfare wasn't enough. The sources say they became very angry.
So they moved to coordinated action and planned armed resistance, conspiring to move against Jerusalem to create a disturbance and stop the work by force.
This escalation forced Nehemiah to confront not just ridicule, but professional intrigue, slander, and deception. He had to navigate all three.
Let's take the first one, intrigue, used as the distraction.
They invited Nehemiah 4 separate times to meet at Kepharim in the plain of Ono.
And this plain was about 25 miles away, deliberately chosen as a remote, exposed meeting ground between Judah and Samaria.
It was a trap.
And Nehemiah's refusal was direct and showed his single-minded purpose.
I am engaged in important work, and I am unable to come down. Why should the work come to a halt when I leave it to come down to you?
He saw right through it. He knew their intent was to harm him, and his absence would halt the entire enterprise, leaving the workers vulnerable to attack.
The mission trumped their attempts at diplomacy, so next they tried innuendo as a discrediting campaign.
Sanballat upped the ante by sending an open letter, a public document that all the Jews could see. And it alleged that Nehemiah was planning a revolt, that he intended to make himself king, and had even hired prophets to announce this rebellion.
The purpose of this public smear was to create division, fear, and slackness among the workers. If Nehemiah was a secret rebel, then the workers were putting themselves in danger of royal punishment.
Nehemiah's counter was swift. A flat denial, all of this is a figment of your imagination, coupled with a prayer for strength. He relied on his integrity and his record to nullify the slander.
Finally, the most dangerous attempt, intimidation, disguised as deception.
The false prophet Shemaiah, a hired agent of Tobiah and Sanballat, tried to lure Nehemiah into seeking sanctuary in the innermost part of the temple.
He claimed assassins were coming for him that very night.
This was a brilliant, strategic religious trap designed to destroy Nehemiah's spiritual authority among the very people he was leading.
We have to pause and understand why this was the ultimate trap.
Please elaborate. Why was entering the temple such a catastrophic sin for Nehemiah, who was, after all, a righteous leader?
Because of the strict Mosaic Law concerning the sanctity of the holy places. The law explicitly forbade anyone but the Lord's anointed priests from entering the holy places of the temple.
And Nehemiah was a layman, the governor, not a priest.
So if Nehemiah had entered the temple to save his own life, he would have committed a profound sin against the foundational law.
The very law he was striving to restore in Jerusalem.
Exactly. The enemy's goal wasn't just to kill him, but to brand him as a hypocrite, a leader who disregarded the law for personal survival.
It would have destroyed his spiritual credibility and justified the people's own failure to obey the covenant.
But Nehemiah saw through the lie. He recognized the enemy's hired hand and refused. Should a man like me run away, I will not go.
The combination of prayer and continued work was the best answer, but when the threat of armed force became overwhelming, Nehemiah didn't rely on faith alone.
No, he merged faith with common sense, leading to that famous image of the builder and the soldier.
When their adversaries moved from conspiracy to a planned armed attack, Nehemiah responded strategically. Continued prayer, continued work, and aggressive self-defense.
He stationed people by families in the most exposed places, armed with swords, spears, and bows.
This resulted in the famous dual role of the worker, an image of commitment that's just burned into history.
Half the men worked, half guarded. Those carrying loads did so by keeping one hand on the work and the other on their weapon. The builders literally had their swords strapped to their sides while they laid stones.
And the logistical dedication was meticulous. Nehemiah enforced military discipline.
Workers slept in Jerusalem as guards by night and workers by day. They didn't even change their clothes. Even when getting a drink of water, they were on continuous duty.
He stationed a trumpeter near him to signal where men should gather instantly in case of a scattered attack, reassuring them, "Our God will fight for us."
And the outcome, given the overwhelming hostility, the logistical nightmare, and the requirement for armed labor, is nothing short of miraculous.
The walls were completed in a stunning 52 days.
52 days. On the 25th day of the month, Elul.
Just think about that speed. A massive foundational engineering project that had defeated the community for 140 years was completed in less than 2 months.
That rapid success was a profound psychological weapon. Israel's enemies, when they heard and saw this finished wall, were greatly disheartened.
They realized and acknowledged that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God.
The best answer to opposition is fulfilling God's will with swift competence.
That is truly the high point of the physical restoration. But now we have to pivot sharply because the external threats were contained, but the greatest threat to the community was often internal.
Which brings us to the shocking events of Section 3. The ethical governor and internal oppression in Chapter 5.
This chapter is arguably the most dramatic betrayal in the entire book.
It is. While the people were working tirelessly, often armed, there arose a great outcry from the laborers and their wives.
And it was directed not against Sanballat or the Arab raiders,
but against fellow Jews, the wealthy aristocrats and officials of Jerusalem.
The problem was a crisis of economic injustice born out of severe hardship. They were facing famine conditions,
which had forced the common people to mortgage their fields, their vineyards, and their homes, using them as collateral simply to obtain grain to survive.
And the exploitation was threefold, systematically violating the core social ethics of the Mosaic Law.
First, the wealthier Jews were charging interest on those loans, which was expressly forbidden when lending to a fellow Israelite facing poverty,
which guaranteed perpetual debt.
Second, the people were borrowing money not just to eat, but to pay the heavy Persian king's taxes, plunging them even deeper into a debt spiral that was impossible to escape.
And third, and most brutally, the debt became so extreme that the wealthy were taking the children of the poor into slavery to settle these financial obligations.
The cry was devastating. Quote, "We are forced to subject our sons and our daughters to slavery, and some of our daughters have already been subjected to slavery."
The irony here is just gut-wrenching. Nehemiah and others had previously paid large sums of money to Gentiles in Babylonia to liberate Jewish slaves so they could return to the Promised Land.
And now they find their own brethren re-enslaving the returnees in Jerusalem. The wealthy were prioritizing profit over the very covenant they had just sworn to rebuild.
Nehemiah's reaction was intense, but disciplined. He was very angry when I heard their outcry and these complaints,
But he didn't fly off the handle. He paused. He said he considered these things carefully.
which led to a formal, public complaint registered with the wealthy and officials at a great public assembly.
His demand was uncompromising and immediate, requiring total restitution.
He said, "This very day return to them their fields, their vineyards, their olive trees, and their houses, along with the interest that you are exacting from them."
This wasn't a recommendation. It was a command for immediate legal and financial reversal.
And when the wealthy Jews were confronted by Nehemiah's authority and the witness of the assembly, the source notes they were utterly silent.
They knew their actions were flagrantly against the law.
Nehemiah then called the priests to make the wealthy and officials swear a binding oath before God to make the restitution.
And the sealing of this oath was highly dramatic and symbolic.
He shook out his own garment, symbolizing a terrifying curse for anyone who did not fulfill the promise.
He declared, "In this way may God shake out from his house and his property every person who does not carry out this matter."
And the people agreed, they praised the Lord, and for the moment did as they had promised.
This commitment to ethical conduct is entirely consistent with Nehemiah's personal standard, which he maintained throughout his entire tenure.
He didn't just demand ethical behavior from others, he lived it out for 12 years straight.
That's a long time to live under that kind of self-imposed austerity. From the 20th year until the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, a full 12 years, Nehemiah served as governor without claiming the allotted food allowance that his predecessors had taken.
An allowance that included a substantial sum of 40 shekels of silver.
He forgave what was legitimately his due as a political official. Furthermore, he refused to acquire any real estate during that time, devoting his entire attention to the work of rebuilding.
And the remarkable thing is, he wasn't just self-sufficient, he was a provider.
He personally paid for the daily provision for over 150 Jews and officials who dined with him routinely.
This daily provision included an ox, 6 select sheep, and wine abundance, all paid for out of his own pocket.
This example of self-denial sets a profound precedent for ethical leadership that anticipates later scriptural teaching. He recognized that demanding the full extent of what was legally his would have placed a burden on an already struggling poor community.
He prioritized the people's welfare over his legal entitlement. He proved that God's appointed leader will pay a steep personal price for doing what is right and for supplying the needs of God's people.
The plans of God always include the welfare of his people, the physical welfare, not just the spiritual.
With the walls rebuilt and the internal ethical crisis temporarily resolved, Nehemiah turned to Section 4, the spiritual restoration.
Shifting the focus entirely from the physical stone foundation to the spiritual foundation of the community, which was ultimately much more difficult to maintain.
This shift begins with the solemn and powerful reading of the law described in Nehemiah chapter 8.
The setting was highly significant. The plaza in front of the water gate on the first day of the 7th month, the Feast of Trumpets. The assembly included all the people, men, women, and children who could understand.
Ezra the scribe, who had been there before Nehemiah, took center stage. He stood on a towering wooden platform and read the law for hours.
From dawn till noon, this massive commitment of time shows the people's genuine spiritual hunger and desire to learn God's word, a key sign that the revival was authentic.
But the reading was not just a recital. The Levites played a critical intermediary role in the instruction.
They didn't just read the ancient text. They engaged in actively explaining it and imparting insight.
This ceremony mirrors the form of Israelite worship that was developing in exile, the precursor to the synagogue service.
The law was read, and then it was contextualized, explained, and applied, and the result. The people gained understanding from what was read. It was an intellectual and spiritual comprehension.
And the response was immediate and overwhelming. As the people understood the law, specifically the covenant requirements they had consistently broken, conviction of sin fell on them.
It led to deep mourning and weeping. The conviction of their shortcomings was profound because they realized their history of failure.
They realized that their current situation, being slaves in their own land, dependent on the Persian king's taxes and decrees, was a direct, predictable consequence of generations of breaking this very covenant.
However, the leaders, Nehemiah, Ezra, and the Levites, commanded them to stop grieving.
They reminded the people that the Feast of Trumpets was a holy day, a day of celebration, not sorrow. The joy of the Lord must be their strength going forward.
So the mourning turned into celebratory action. They departed to eat delicacies and drink sweet drinks, making sure to share portions generously with those who had nothing prepared.
And the text says they enjoyed tremendous joy because they had finally gained insight and understanding into the matters that had been made known to them.
This spiritual momentum immediately led to sustained action, found in the revival of the Feast of Tabernacles.
On the very next day, the leaders met again with Ezra to dive deeper into the words of the law.
And in their continued study, they rediscover the command to live in temporary shelters for the duration of the festival of the seventh month.
The instruction was clear. Build shelters on their roofs, courtyards, and plazas using specific branches, olive, myrtle, palm, and others, and live in them for 7 days.
The sources highlight an incredible, almost unbelievable historical detail regarding this observance.
The Israelites had not observed the Feast of Tabernacles in this manner, that is, with full communal fidelity and understanding.
From the days of Joshua, son of Nun, until that day.
Think about the magnitude of that statement. It implies a gap of perhaps 1,000 years since this festival was observed with this level of communal seriousness.
This observance was a powerful return to scriptural fidelity, looking back to their wilderness wandering, something the returned exiles could deeply relate to as people recently wandering in Babylonia.
This intense period of conviction culminated directly in confession and the formal pledge in chapters 9 and 10.
24 days after the Feast of Trumpets, the Israelites assembled again, this time fasting, wearing sackcloth, and engaging in a dramatic two-part service.
Half the day reading the law, followed by half a day of confession and worship.
The Great Confession was an exhaustive survey of Israel's history, recited publicly. It focused on God's consistent faithfulness, choosing Abram, delivering them from Egypt, providing manna and water,
versus Israel's consistent pattern of rebellion, presumption, disobedience, and sin.
And the conclusion of this historical reflection was brutally honest and self-critical. Despite God's goodness, the returned community acknowledged their current status.
So today we are slaves, and we are in great distress.
They were physically in the land, benefiting from its produce, but that produce went straight to the kings, placed over them due to the sins of their ancestors.
This collective confession is vital. It proves that the leaders of post-exilic Judaism did not view their return from Babylon as the final, glorious fulfillment of the Messianic age.
They understood they were still in a condition of spiritual and political bondage, waiting for ultimate redemption.
This conviction immediately led to the formal covenant renewal.
The faithful remnant, joined by the rest of the community, including wives and children, able to understand the gravity of the oath, signed a formal commitment, a binding agreement to obey Yahweh again.
And the pledge centered on 3 critical areas identified as the historical weakness of Israel.
The things necessary to maintain the purity and distinction of the restoration community.
Pledge 1, separation. They committed not to intermarry with the surrounding, often idolatrous peoples, the Ammonites, Moabites, Ashdodites.
This was essential because intermarriage was historically the primary vehicle for syncretism and disobedience, leading to the dilution of their faith.
Pledge 2, holy time. They committed to strictly keeping the Sabbath day holy, no buying or selling from neighboring peoples on that day, and observing the sabbatical year.
Letting fields lie fallow and canceling loans. This restored the economic, spiritual, and social rhythm required by the covenant.
And Pledge 3, holy place and financial commitment.
They committed to ensuring the sustainability of the temple service financially. This included giving 1/3 of a shekel each year for the work of the temple, bringing wood offerings, first fruits, firstborn of cattle.
And crucially, paying their basic tithe, tax 1/10 of the produce to the Levites. Their final declaration was clear. We will not neglect the temple of our God.
With the spiritual house apparently in order and the physical structure finished, we move into Section 5, the final reforms and Nehemiah's lasting legacy.
The first step after the covenant was dedicating the achievement. Dedicating the walls and populating the city was critical.
Because even though the walls were finished, the city was still spread out and large, but had a dangerously small population,
making it vulnerable to infiltration and future attack.
Nehemiah initiated another pragmatic administrative plan to increase security. 1 family and 10 of those currently living outside the city walls would be chosen by lot and moved into Jerusalem permanently.
This combined the spiritual goal of living in the holy city with the practical necessity of defense and stability.
The dedication ceremony itself was grand and highly organized. Levites and singers were assembled from surrounding settlements.
The process began with the priests and Levites ritually purifying themselves, the people, the gates, and the entire structure of the wall, consecrating it to divine purpose.
Then came the grand procession, an incredible logistical spectacle. Nehemiah appointed two massive choirs to give thanks.
One choir, led by Ezra the scribe, proceeded atop the wall counterclockwise, past the steps of the city of David and toward the temple.
The second choir, led by Nehemiah himself, proceeded in the opposite direction, clockwise, passing the Tower of the Ovens, the Broad Wall, and the other major gates, beating the first choir right at the temple.
Both groups marched and sang as they walked, offering great sacrifices and rejoicing.
The rejoicing in Jerusalem was so great, so loud, that the text says it could be heard from far away.
The very structure Tobiah had scoffed at was now a monument of divine evidence and communal joy.
Nehemiah then reestablished the detailed temple service according to King David's ancient organization, appointing trustworthy men over the storerooms for tithes and contributions.
Now we shift to the tragic but necessary climax. Nehemiah's second-term reforms.
Nehemiah had returned to King Artaxerxes around 432 BC to fulfill his duties. When he requested leave to return to Jerusalem around 431 BC, what he found was that the community had spectacularly backslid.
The spiritual foundation they had sworn to uphold had just fractured.
The initial reform was the expulsion of foreigners and Tobiah. The reading of the law revealed that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. This led to the exclusion of all foreigners and those of mixed ancestry from the sacred spaces.
But the corruption extended right to the highest office. Nehemiah returned and discovered that Eliashib, the high priest, who was related to the antagonist Tobiah,
Had cleared out a crucial temple storeroom, meant for tithes, grain, and sacred equipment, and converted it into a private apartment for his enemy, Tobiah, the Ammonite official.
This was the ultimate sacrilege and a shocking political betrayal. The spiritual leader was literally giving space and comfort to the physical and political enemy within the holy precinct itself.
Nehemiah's reaction was explosive. The text says he was very upset. He acted immediately, personally throwing all of Tobiah's household possessions out of the storeroom.
Then ordered the rooms ritually purified and restored the temple equipment to its proper function. He recognized that the purity of their religion had to be maintained at any cost, regardless of whose family connections were involved.
And the high priest's actions had caused a direct domino effect on the rest of the community.
The revival of tithing was desperately needed. Because the community saw the corruption and had neglected their tithes, the Levites and singers who depended on those tithes for their livelihood had abandoned their sacred service.
They had returned to their fields just to feed their families.
Nehemiah reprimanded the leaders sharply. Why is the temple of God neglected? His intervention led to the people restarting their tithes immediately.
He set trustworthy men in place to oversee the distribution of those tithes fairly, preventing the corruption that Eliashib had started.
Next was Sabbath enforcement. Nehemiah observed both Tyrian merchants and Jews trading on the Sabbath, even bringing fish, grain, and wine into Jerusalem on that holy day.
He registered a complaint with the nobles, reminding them that profaning the Sabbath was precisely why God had brought misfortune upon them previously, leading to the exile.
His practical solution was severe but highly effective. He ordered the gates of Jerusalem locked from the evening shadows before the Sabbath until after, stationing his own men there to ensure no load entered.
And when foreign traders tried to camp outside the walls waiting for Sunday, he warned them, "If you repeat this, I will forcibly remove you."
The threat worked. They stopped coming on the Sabbath.
The final and perhaps most intensely documented reform concerned rebuking mixed marriage.
He found men of Judah married to foreign women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, resulting in a demographic crisis. Half their children were unable to speak the language of Judah.
This was more than just a cultural problem. It was spiritual and cultural annihilation in the making. If the next generation couldn't even understand the law being read, the covenant was doomed.
Nehemiah's reaction was recorded with almost shocking detail to illustrate the severity of the backsliding.
He registered a severe complaint, called down a curse upon them, and then engaged in physical discipline. He struck some of the men and literally pulled out their hair.
He made them swear an oath forbidding future mixed marriages, citing King Solomon's downfall as a definitive consequence of similar actions.
And the ultimate act of purification was the banishment of the high priest Eliashib's own grandson, who was the son-in-law of Sanballat, the chief antagonist.
He banished him from his sight, purifying the community of everything foreign, and assigning specific duties to the purified priests and Levites.
It's a powerful, almost tragic ending to a story about restoration. Nehemiah, the layman and administrator, accomplished the physical fortification of Jerusalem and the total restoration of the Mosaic Law as Israel's functional authority.
His legacy is defined by his method, a single-minded purpose: attention to strategic detail, a willingness to delegate authority, deep dedication to service, and constant dependence on God.
A perfect combination of prayer and hard work. He exemplified that zeal for God must be according to the knowledge of God and His law.
His work cemented the foundations laid by Zerubbabel, who rebuilt the temple, and Ezra, who reformed the people through the law. He proved that seemingly impossible feats can be accomplished when a person combines trust in God with meticulous planning and decisive action.
But we must return to the context of the larger narrative. So what does this all mean?
Let's recap the core timeline. A project that failed multiple times, including a stop work order in 458 BC, was successfully completed in a stunning 52 days in 444 BC.
And this was possible due to Nehemiah's prepared leadership, clear organization, and the community buy-in achieved through that initial spiritual revival.
The text forces us to synthesize the two key acts: the quick, successful physical rebuilding of the wall, and the much more difficult, cyclical, spiritual renewal of the covenant.
The wall was a symbol of security and distinction, allowing the community to return to scriptural fidelity.
Yet, we have to emphasize the contrast found in the later chapters. Despite these massive accomplishments, the completed wall, the dedication, the formal pledge to obey the law, the text is clear that the restoration period did not fulfill the promised glories of the ultimate messianic age.
The Jews were still in great distress, still reading the law while acknowledging they were slaves under Persian kings.
The physical return to the land did not equate to the ultimate, final, promised redemption.
They had the physical structure, but they failed to maintain the spiritual fidelity it was designed to protect.
Which leads us to our final thought for you, the learner. Nehemiah's story shows that dedication and obedience can accomplish the seemingly impossible, even when facing both external ridicule and profound internal betrayal.
This combination of zeal and intimate knowledge of God's will is paramount for any major undertaking.
So consider the ultimate measure of Nehemiah's success. Was it the completion of the physical wall in 52 days? A feat visible to all nations and undeniable evidence of God's help?
Or was it the momentary willingness of the people to swear an oath, the covenant, they almost immediately began to break, evidenced by the necessity of his harsh physical reforms upon his return only 12 years later?
Which foundation, the stone wall or the spirit of the people, proved harder ultimately to maintain? Something for you to mull over.